it at all costs in order to save your own reputation. And this happened in a good many cases. But all in all, there was an improvement. There was a general recognition of the four Gospels, and although by the end of the 4th century A.D. there probably were not a dozen copies of them in existence, the influence and implications of them through the more advanced clergy was being felt completely throughout the empire. It was a time in which what we know as the beginnings of formal Christianity, and we then moved from the ante-Nicene period to the post-Nicene fathers, who began to expand. The ante-Nicene, those before the Council of Nicaea, were, might we say, apologists. They were trying to get along with a non-Christian environment. They were therefore, as in the case of Clement of Alexandria and Origen, forced to make certain compromises. They couldn't really come out and call everybody else wrong. So they were careful to try not to offend everybody. But after the Nicene Council, the apologists faded away, and the propagandists moved in with everything they had, and insisted upon this uniformity and conformity of belief. Now, if it is true, as which it looks as though it was, that from the very beginning there was also a stream of mysticism, which perhaps, if we can hazard the thought, was carried along largely by the so-called rejected books. With most of the books no longer in existence, we do not know the full details, but the limited quotations, the small fragments that have come down to us in the writings of the Church Fathers, who were able probably to trace the originals, would indicate that there was a definite mystical content coming into the Christian faith at a comparatively early date. The apocryphal books, particularly those dealing with the life of Christ, also indicate a greater use of miracles, many wonderful happenings that have never gotten into the Orthodox Gospels, strange circumstances, natural phenomena, and all kinds of mysterious, mystical, almost magical elements. And it is probably because of these inclusions that many of the books were rejected for nonconformity. But even though this conformity was not acceptable, there is no doubt in the world that by the 4th century, Christian mysticism was reasonably firmly established. It was based upon one essential point, namely the possibility of interpreting various statements of the Scriptures in a metaphysical manner. That while all things had their literal forms, it was quite possible that these literalisms were symbolical of something else, that everything was not to be taken literally. Most of the early fathers expected everyone to take these ideas literally. But as time went on, even before Nicaea, there is a strong evidence that in Egypt and in Athens there was a metaphysical element coming in. And this metaphysical element was probably preserved in the Gospels most completely in the letters of Paul to the Corinthians. Here we have a considerable statement of a mysticism which also occurs in other of the Pauline writings which are now regarded as apocryphal. So we have the rise of a Christian mysticism. We also find that gradually the Church accepted this. It accepted the possibility of a mystical experience in itself. And gradually the canonization of prominent Church Fathers depended on one of two factors, either martyrdom, which was the larger one, or a mysterious, mystical experience of communion with deity. These two were the basic elements which contributed to canonization. Now, Christian mysticism has come down to us today. It has come down to us within the Catholic Church and also within the Protestant churches. In both of these communions, the mysticism has been largely censored by the doctrines of the sectarian itself. But in spite of this, a constantly increasing mysticism is evident. Now, one of the reasons why mysticism comes in is because with the passing of time and the changes of history, literalism loses dignity. Today, things that were accepted without question 100, 200 years ago are simply no longer tolerated. Interpretations that are completely literal have run against scientific, philosophical, and theological objections. So we have a tendency, which began at the very early time, to interpret all of the essential principles of religion in a mystical manner. This is also justified by the actual words of Christ himself. For he tells on one occasion that if they destroy the temple, he will rebuild it in 3 days. And someone said he means the temple of his own body. And this is an example of the departure from a literalism to an idealism that was compatible with the gradual advancement and unfoldment of human understanding. We also find that throughout the apocryphal books there are to be found a number of apocalyptical experiences of beings lifted up into communion with deity. The only one of these books that survived in the Holy Scripture is the Apocalypse attributed to John. But there was one by Peter, there was one by Paul, there were several others by other disciples, and some by early church fathers. These experiences seem to be an effort to recognize the spirituality of the universe. In the days of the Egyptians and the Greeks, the idea of a physical universe with nothing but a physical foundation was unthinkable. And even the fathers of astronomy, Ptolemy of Alexandria, for example,